All right, well, thank you all for joining us for the Revising Long Documents and Common Grammar Mistakes workshop. Joining us today is Andrew Yim with the Assistant Director of the Writing Center. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Andrew to get us started.
All right, thanks so much, Josh. So hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Yim. I'm currently the Assistant Director of the UNLV Writing Center. And for today's workshop in particular, we're going to be talking about two different concepts. So we're going to spend the first half of today's workshop talking about how to revise your long documents and different strategies and techniques to do so. In the second half of today's presentation, we're going to go through some more common grammar mistakes and errors. So the second part might be a review for some of you, but these are some common grammar mistakes that you might be aware of as you're writing your documents. So I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. So again, the goal for today's workshop is, for the first part, which I think is going to be very key for many of you here, is we're going to be talking about different strategies and ways to revise, edit, and proofreading. So those three words, even though they sound very similar, they actually have some differences in connotation. In addition, we're going to really talk about the goals of, what revising looks like, what editing is, and also what proofreading is going to be for your papers. And then finally, for the second half of today's presentation, we're going to be talking about, common grammar mistakes that you might come across in the paper and things that you might address when you're working on papers for revision. So the first thing you want to think about when it comes to the revision phrase is that there's three types of revisions. There's revising, editing, and proofreading. And the three things we want to make note of is, between revising and editing, we call those recursive processes, which means that with revising and editing, those are steps that will build on each other. So when you revise your paper and when you edit it, and I'll define those terms in a little bit, they're going to start building on each other from when you start your paper to the very end of the process. One thing that we also want to note, whenever you proofread your paper, right? So if you're going to submit a final draft, if you're going to go ahead and submit something for a deadline, you want to say proofreading for the very end. And we'll talk more about what that looks like in a bit. So in this table here, we talk about the differences between revising, editing, and proofreading. So when we talk about the word editing, that generally refers to our entire paper, and we're really focused on the content. So when you're looking at the overall content of your paper, you're thinking about the organization, you're thinking about the flow, you're thinking about maybe, paragraph to paragraph. Do your overall ideas make sense? And if not, how do I go ahead and revise those? The second part that we think about afterwards is this idea of editing, right? So editing is really focused on the sentence level issues, right? So if you're really focused on, trying to clarify maybe like verb usage, nouns, the verb words you use, you might be more concerned with the editing. So it's more to do with the clarity and the sentence structure. Revising and editing is something that you can do throughout the paper. When we say the word proofreading, that's probably like, you say that for the final step, which proofreading is going through your paper one more time and seeing if you can catch any of those any of those details, right? If you're working on a presentation, you're working on a paper, anything that when you read through it, it stands out to you in your last read through, those are the things you address and fix before you submit. And we'll talk more about these differences throughout this first half of the presentation. If you have any questions about the differences between revising, editing, or proofreading, feel free to write it in the chat box, and I can address those questions as we get to the second half of today's presentation. So when it comes to revising, we really want to be thinking about the organization and the content of your overall paper. So, for any documents you guys are working on for this week for the Graduate Writing Bootcamp, you want to first think about what is your overall purpose for your document, right? So you might be working on a dissertation, you might be working on a PowerPoint presentation, you might be working on a paper for a graduate class. So you always want to be thinking about, what is my purpose, right? Is my purpose to inform my audience of a certain topic? Am I trying to convince my professor that my topic is better than someone else's? So once you identify your purpose, that's going to really help you with the revision. Then you can start to address, the structure, organization, and flow. Once you know your purpose, you can make those revisions. And then once you know your purpose, you can also start to narrow down your topic and start to elaborate on your ideas. And then finally, you can really think about the connections between a thesis and the other ideas in your paper. So for example, if I'm revising this PowerPoint, my goal of this PowerPoint or document is to make sure that I'm informing you of what the revision process looks like and what revising is. In order to do so, I need to strengthen, the font size. I have to make sure that the information you read in this slide makes sense. And then from there, I might need to narrow down, some of the topics that I talk about in regards to my presentation. And then I also make sure that hopefully when I talk about revision, those key ideas connect back to my overall purpose or thesis. So those are some questions or ways you can outline your overall revising process. So takeaway from this slide, always be thinking about purpose. And once you know your purpose, you can start making those larger structural changes. So when we come to revising strategies, feel free to write what you use in the chat box. But generally, some typical revision strategies might include reading your document out loud, and you might do this on your own. If you prefer to read it with another person, feel free to come to the Writing Center. We offer appointments both in person and online, so you can read your document to another person to get some feedback. A second helpful strategy for revision is actually reading your topic sentences out loud. So there's a strategy that works for a lot of different dissertation papers where if I read the first sentence of your overall paragraph, it should clearly tell me what the paragraph's about. If someone reads your topic sentence and your body doesn't match the topic sentence, you probably need to revise your topic sentences. Number three, working on an outline. So there's a lot of different ways to outline. You can use, what we call a reverse outline, where you work from the end of your paper to the beginning. Outlining can also look like, writing out your subpoints. Again, someone else read it. So there are studies that show that if you keep reading your paper for hours and hours and hours, there comes a point where you just hit a roadblock and you physically can't look at it anymore. So again, if you prefer or you want someone to read your paper, feel free to make a Writing Center appointment. And then finally, you can physically cut and reorganize a document. So there's some strategies where people will take their actual piece of paper, cut it up into different segments, and then rearrange it on a table. So again, if you guys would like to in the chat box, feel free to also write down some revision strategies that you might utilize, and we can share those in a bit. So that's all about the revision process, right? So revision, know your purpose, and then think about strategies you might use to revise the content to meet your overall purpose. Once we address the step one, then we move to step two, which is all about editing. And editing deals with more of the actual sentence level issues. So you're concerned with the clarity, but with clarity, you're concerned with some of the sentence structure, right? So oftentimes when you go through a very long document, you want to make sure that some of the editing goals include, breaking up lengthy sentences and paragraphs. So often when I look through a document for people in the Writing Center, someone might have a very good sentence, but it's really, really long, right? A lot of contractions. So sometimes I say, just break it up, use a period, use a semicolon. Number two is also thinking about cutting down on wordiness and reducing jargon. So a lot of times people like myself can be very wordy, right? You can write a very long sentence and think, oh, it makes sense. But once someone else looks at it, you might have to take out some words or phrases to cut it down. In addition, checking on your word choice. So oftentimes, one thing that writers might struggle with is using the same verb usage over and over. Like for myself, I like to use similar verbs. So when you're using, verbs or words in your paper, make sure that the words you're giving align with the definitions you're trying to portray to your audience. And then number 4 and 5, thinking about the tone in your paper. So oftentimes with academic writing, you want to achieve a certain kind of tone that meets journal expectations or people you write for. And then finally, this is something that you can kind of talk about with your committee or also with people you write for, is changing direct quotes into paraphrases. So often with MLA, APA, and Chicago style, each citation style has a very strict rule on should you use direct quotes or should you paraphrase. So check with your professor about what they're looking for. And all of those things relate back to the editing process, right? So once you get past the organization, you can start getting more concerned with the sentence level errors in your paper. So again, you can think about your own strategies for editing in the overall paper, and feel free to write them in the chat box and share with others. But some strategies we recommend in the Writing Center is number one, examining the vague words you use. Number two, thinking about all the technical terms you're using, and do all the definitions make sense to your audience, or do you need to clarify, or do you need to take out the words? Um, I would also say like number four is what we'll be doing a little bit later on. So later on, we'll be talking more about like, common grammar mistakes or errors. And you might consider like, what would you consider your common patterns of error to be in a paper? For me, mine is I like to use the same verbs a lot, right? So when you read my papers, it turns out I've used a word like 15 times and I need to kind of vary the word usage. So start thinking about maybe what are some common, grammatical patterns you might be seeing in your writing. And then finally, taking out some non-essential words and phrases. So this is something that will be also as part of the final step for proofreading is thinking about this phrase or sentence you wrote, does it need to be taken out or not? So are there any questions on the first two steps so far? So when we move into the last step of proofreading, this means that we're very concerned with the overall presentation and it's dealing with the very small details of the document. So oftentimes people might get very caught up in like, oh, Andrew, my font size is, not the same as this, or, oh, Andrew, I realized that, my spelling and punctuation isn't necessarily correct. So what we would say is when you're working on your document, this is something that you could save for the final read through or right before you submit, because oftentimes, spelling, punctuation, other grammar mistakes, reformatting your header or body font, a lot of those things can be addressed in the final read through. As long as your overall paper, can be understood by yourself or someone else, proofreading just catches some of those smaller mistakes moving forward. And when it comes to proofreading strategies, this also can be aligned with the first two steps. You might consider reading from your last sentence up, so read backwards. So instead of reading from your topic sentence to the bottom, read from your concluding sentence up. You might also consider, changing your text appearance. So maybe this might not apply so much to like a Microsoft Word document, but when you're working with, Canva or other technologies where you can, format a document nicely. You could always play around with like different header fonts and body fonts. In addition to, MLA, APA, and Chicago style, they have very different citations. So those are some things that you might address in the proofreading stage. And then finally, you might take some time to actually look over the genre in your field or document. So, from my understanding, right, from my field in writing centers with our genre, it can be very different when you write between a science classroom or even a business classroom. So thinking about the different ways of writing could affect how you proofread. And then finally, this is something that we can all think about through the second half of today's presentation is, I've identified that verb usage and the use of verbs is something that I really struggle with in my own writing. So start maybe thinking about, hopefully throughout this presentation, what are some, things that you struggle in your writing that you can start to think about. So those are the three steps regarding when you revise your overall paper. And there are a few other things we also want to address as part of today's presentation. So number one, we want to be thinking about clarity. So whenever you write your overall paragraphs or you write, your PowerPoints, you want to make sure that you're giving sentences that are very clear and give your ideas across. And oftentimes you want to consider the words you're using, because sometimes words that you give in your paper may be clear to you, but it may not be clear to your audience and you might need to take it off. And if you feel like you have a hard time addressing clarity in your paper, one strategy that you can think about is, meeting with somebody or coming to the writing center. And a lot of our consultants can help you think about, all right, when they read the paper, the document to you out loud or vice versa, these are things that need to be addressed with the clarity aspect. Another thing to consider, something too, and we'll do a little exercise for everyone here to kind of test, you know, in terms of reducing wordiness. So as you guys can see here, I have 3 sentences under eliminate placeholders, eliminate nominalizations, and then swap out phrases for single words. So what we're going to do in this slide actually is we're going to do just a quick, check-in. And for this first sentence here, we talked about earlier on practicing, those 3 steps in order to revise your paper. Well, we're going to do it right now for this first sentence here. So you see this first sentence says, there are many causes of poverty. They include ... So maybe let's just take 30 seconds to a minute and think about, in the chat box, and feel free to write your answer down. How could you possibly revise these 2 sentences into one? And I will show you the answer in a little bit, but I'll give you guys about 30 seconds. Feel free to think about, when you look at these 2 sentences, how can we eliminate the placeholder and possibly bring it back into one sentence? Cool. So I think Evelyn wrote an answer. Okay, thanks, Evelyn. All right. Yeah, I'll give you guys another 20 seconds just to see if there's a way to combine them. And then we can just kind of talk about, how do we apply those 3 steps with reducing wordiness. So obviously, I think I saw a few good examples so far. In this case for me, what I did is I literally just removed the words there are and they, and I literally just said the many causes of poverty include ... And I kind of streamlined the process, right? But I'm following the 3 steps. I'm thinking about which stage am I focusing on. In this case, I would probably be thinking more about, this would be probably fall more under the proofreading stage, where I'm looking at how to change your sentence structure, and that's something that takes time and practice, but it's a skill that you want to be developing over time. So let's try the second one here. So this thing is called eliminate nominalizations, but let's try the second example. So the sentence here says, the bigot caused the introduction of anger into the situation. By trying to eliminate a nominalization or words, how can we make this sentence possibly a little bit shorter? So I'll give you guys maybe 30 seconds to a minute to write a response, and then we'll see what we come up with. Okay, so for this one here, yeah, perfect. So I think Lisa wrote it. I think it was the right timing. So yeah, for this case, what you can do is you can start taking out some of the words. So you would take out caused, and then you could say the bigot introduced anger into the situation. So again, I know that these are simple exercises, but the point of this activity, and the same for the third one here, is really be thinking about, when you're looking at your sentences, how do you find ways to go ahead and revise? So this is just kind of a quick exercise demonstrating that, whenever you're going through your paper, always be thinking about how can you reduce the wordiness and also make sure it's clear to your audience overall. So the next part I want to talk about too is going back to the 3-step process I showed you earlier on, is you really want to be thinking about the jargon that you're introducing to your audience. So for all of you here, you come from many different backgrounds or different majors, and all of you use different types of phrases or words that refer specifically to your field or major. And for someone like myself who's not in your field or major, your goal and in your papers a lot of times is to inform someone of your topic. But you need to think about, for your specific audience, do you need to give a lot of definition to certain words? Or when you give a word to your audience, does your audience understand your, intent? And oftentimes, this is something you kind of have to play around with, is in your papers, when you write your dissertations or other assignments, sometimes your audience might know the word very clearly, so you don't need to go into much background detail. Other times you might have to give a very long, detailed explanation to help your audience help your audience understand where you're coming from. So this is something that I would say, kind of think about as you're working with your papers, is when you're working with any kind of audience or you're talking to other people, do they understand your jargon or specific terminology or not. In addition to, this is something that kind of goes back to jargon, is thinking about style and how style impacts your writing, right? So when we talk about style, there's a big difference on maybe how we write emails to text messages to our friends versus the emails we write to our professors. And when it comes to style, you really have to consider your audience when you're writing. So the best example I can give you for myself personally is I have to email a lot of different people, and sometimes like there's a difference between when I email one of our consultants versus when I email a dean of a school, right? Because if I email the dean of a school, they don't know me very well. And the only modality I have to convey my style of writing is, by being professional, right? Being descriptive, thinking about the jargon I'm using versus someone in the writing center who, they're a consultant, they know me kind of well. I can, be a little bit more casual with the language I'm using as long as I'm clear. So that's just the thing you also want to think about too, is, thinking about where you are, if you're in a class, if you're with your friends and you're writing something, making sure that your writing is always clear and succinct, but also considering how much jargon or terminology do you need to define for your audience or not. This is the same with tone. And again, tone, it can be a little complicated because, different people might read things a little bit differently. But oftentimes, when you read a sentence, people have, you have to consider how do people interpret the sentence, because it might reveal, how you view a certain topic or not. So oftentimes with academic writing, you want to make sure you have an objective tone. So for example, here, this example says, opponents of this measure are crazy. So if I read this sentence, out of context, my initial impression of the author is the author thinks that every person who is against this law or proposition, they're crazy, right? They don't have regard for other people, and I shouldn't listen to them. Versus if we say this sentence, those who oppose this measure may not be considering all the relevant information. So in the second sentence, we can see that the author's tone changes by trying to convey that, oh, people who are not necessarily, for this, law or proposition, they may not be they may not be seeing both sides of the argument. And this is something you also want to be thinking about as you write, because oftentimes what we think about in our heads, it makes sense to us. But when we put something on paper, you might read it and say, like, Andrew, that sounds great. Like, I meant, like, the first sentence, I was trying to say that people do not consider all sides. But the rest of the world might see, oh, you wrote a sentence that clearly tells us that you think everyone on the other side, is crazy. So again, tone is something that you want to always be thinking about when you're writing. Every sentence you write, think about how someone else might interpret it. So this is something that's been coming up more in academic writing recently, is this idea of inclusivity, or people using words to conform to their audience. And the first example I want to bring up is regarding MLA and APA. So for anyone here who's very familiar with APA 7th or MLA 8th, recently the rule has changed where instead of using like he or she for identifying male and female, they've actually changed the rule where now you can use singular they to refer to people who may or may not have identified their genres. And I've also been told by certain professors that whenever you quote an author or someone who has never identified themselves as male, female, or another gender, using they is considered proper, because it's not necessarily offending anyone. So inclusivity is something you also consider in your writing, especially for the audiences you're trying to convey or reach out to. And then other things to also keep in mind is when we think about STEM and the humanities, I'm actually from a humanities background. So for myself personally with humanities, a lot of these things mentioned in this PowerPoint about using both declaratory and interrogatory sentences, varying my sentence length and using active and passive voice. Those are things I've come across a lot in the humanities. There are a few professors who I've written for where they're very clear, Andrew, use active voice, right? Don't really use passive voice unless you have to. Versus with STEM writing, I know I have friends in the STEM field where when they write, they've been told, write short, clear sentences, always use past active voice, only passive voice once in a while. And they're also, have a very rigid structure and language and form. So this comes back to also the genre that you're writing for. So if you're writing a PhD for a STEM field versus maybe the English field, there might be some differences in interpretation on how your overall structure looks like for your paper. And this is something that you'll have to deal with, both in academia and also in your everyday life, right? So I know there's a lot of information and brain dump, and we'll take a break in a little bit and see if there's any questions. But at the end of the day, with all the strategies that I'm giving you regarding, proofreading, editing, and revising, so strategies to keep in mind is as you guys work on your dissertations or any similar kinds of assignments, make sure that you're frequently backing up your work. So thinking about using, different kinds of cloud storage, thumb drives. I haven't really used Rebel files, but I've heard it's pretty good. For myself personally, I use Google Drive, and I also have like a terabyte of data on a flash drive. In addition, make sure that you keep drafts of all your work and revisions, because as you revise, when you start from the very beginning to the very end, by keeping track of your old drafts, it really helps you kind of like, think about where you're starting and where you're going. And in addition to, everyone is different, but whenever you're writing, really be thinking about, your writing process. So the things that Layla went over in the previous presentation, what you learned yesterday, be thinking about how all that information, along with this information, this PowerPoint, can help you think about, with tracking your work. If are you a person who likes to save a lot of old papers, or do you prefer to, when you think of a great idea, write it down right away? Or having those systems in place will really help you out. In addition, feel free to use the comment function. So I'm a big fan of using, Google Docs, because you're able to make a lot of comments. And then these days with Google Docs or Google Excel spreadsheets, even if you make changes, you can always go back and access a previous file if something gets deleted. And then finally, if you love to color code your sources and themes, feel free to do so. So as you guys go through, proofreading, editing, and revising your document, if you start to see like maybe similar errors of pattern in your writing, feel free to color code it in green. There's always been a strategy I've been told, oh, Andrew, I really struggle with, subject verb agreement. I might highlight those in green. So as I start to see, this pattern over and over again, this is maybe something that I can learn to correct over time, or something I need to really keep in mind moving forward. And that's actually moving into some of the grammar stuff. So before we move into the grammar stuff, because a lot of the grammar stuff, the second part of today's PowerPoint is to really just kind of identify, common grammar errors and thinking about which ones are ones that you might struggle with or have to review. Are there any questions regarding the three different types of, editing, proofreading? So are there any questions about those so far? So that was the first half of today's presentation, was just to really understand, what those three different stages look like. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me as we go through the presentation. So the second half is more going to be a review of a lot of grammar terminology, and thinking about, like, out of all of these different types of grammar terminology, like which ones might you struggle with, or ones that you have to really keep in mind. So the first one we talk about is, verb tense. So when it comes to verb tense, especially for some people, verb tense can be very difficult because it's hard to know when you need to use, present tense, simple past, or present perfect. And when it comes to like the APA, MLA, or AP style guides, sometimes they have a preference for what you should use. So feel free to go back and like think about, okay, when is it appropriate to use like the simple present, like research, right, at the present moment? When is it appropriate to use the past tense or researched? Or when is it important to use present perfect? Present perfect being, right, an event that happened in the past, but that still has influence on today. They have research, right? So it would happen previously, but it's still, impacting today's society. So there's a lot more verb tenses out there. I know there's about 6 common ones, but generally simple present, simple past, and present perfect. These are the 3 you'll come across a lot in your academic career. So in addition, some things we have to keep in mind is regarding these common verb tense mistakes. So what we're going to do is, again, just like do a quick checkup. So for the first thing here is, instead of using present perfect, you might use the past instead. So for the first sentence here, you always want to kind of consider like the differences between the present perfect and simple past. So the first part is they have gone to the store yesterday versus they went to the store yesterday. And as you can see, the sentences have very similar meanings. However, based on the present perfect and simple past, there's slight differences in how someone reads your sentence. Same with the second sentence, right? The difference between experienced and experience. There's a very big difference in how someone in your audience is going to interpret the information. If I read female GTAs experience, amounts of gaslighting, it makes it sound like it happened in the past, is maybe no longer an issue, versus, right, female GTAs experience, gaslighting today, something that's still going on presently. So these are things that we really want to consider moving forward. So in addition to, we also really want to think about the unnecessary shifts in tense. So thinking about number 1, researchers collected multiple samples and ran them through the centrifuge. So again, right, thinking about, using parallelism, using the same verb usage throughout a sentence. So either in this case, you would say collected and ran, or researchers collect and run. So that's another rule to kind of keep in mind. So again, I know, verb tense is a very common thing that, we all are familiar with. But the reason I point this out is because, when you write a very long document and you might be spending hours and hours on an essay or another assignment, verb tense is something that can slip by us very quickly. So this is just something to kind of keep in mind as you move forward. So the next one that can also be difficult to we forget about sometimes is subject-verb agreement. So when we talk about subject-verb agreement, it's the idea that both the verb tense and the subject, agree with each other. And generally, the rule is, if you have a singular noun, then it is. If they have a plural noun, you'll use are. In addition to, down below, when we have a prepositional phrase like of the results, you generally want to think about before the prepositional phrase. If it's a singular noun, then it'll be reveals. If it was actually a plural noun before the prepositional phrase, then there would be no s. So again, a lot of these rules with subject verb agreement can be difficult to interpret, and maybe not in a one sentence text message, but when you write, a very long paper, subject verb agreement is one that we have to, constantly remember, right? Is thinking about every noun that we're giving, are we using the right verb agreement? And if this is something that is difficult for you to catch on your own, it's not, a lot of people don't necessarily have a hard time with this, but if you feel like you're a person who really struggles with subject verb agreement, this is something that, the Writing Center can potentially help you with. As you read through your document, we can help you figure out, like, maybe this word needs an S or doesn't need an S. So Besides some subject-verb agreement, another one that can be hard to interpret is the idea of parallelism. And parallelism is hard to catch because using parallel structure is important when you look at a list of items. So as you can see in the example down below, we use parallel structure to connect several different words or phrases. So again, in this sentence, we have, buy, have prepared, wrapped, and ignite. So in this case, thinking about, the correct way to say the sentence would be, before the barbecue, you should buy some steaks, prepare a marinade, wrap the potatoes in foil, and ignite the charcoal. So one thing to keep in mind when you're working on proofreading or proofreading is, your parallelism is, does every sentence have a similar structure in terms of verb usage, or do the items in the list match each other? So as you can see here, buy, prepare, wrap, and ignite. Those are things to also keep in mind too. And again, this is something that as you write a very long document, you might start to, write a lot of sentences. And parallel structure, this is something I see quite often in papers is people, will, most of the paper you're addressing your parallelism, but there's always a few of the sentences where someone forgets to, have words or phrases that should be similar to each other. And that's something we can also help you with if you struggle with parallelism in the center itself. Some other things to keep in mind is thinking about, does your sentence classify as both an independent clause or a dependent clause? And I think with independent clauses, oftentimes those are complete sentences. They have a subject and verb. They can stand by themselves. And when you read it, it's basically a complete sentence. Oftentimes people might write a dependent clause where it has a subject and verb, but it can't necessarily stand by itself as a sentence. And we have this analogy down below with the independent clause. You have a guy riding a bike, and in the dependent clause, you have two people riding a bike because it takes more than one to ride the bike. And even with two people, it's not enough versus the one person by themselves. It's a complete sentence. So we're going to practice this a little bit down below. So as you guys can see, this is a fragment of a sentence, right? So a fragment is, incomplete. There's no subject or verb. And we're going to think about, with this sentence here, because the results were inconclusive, I'm going to give you guys a minute to maybe think about, what might you add here to kind of, bolster the sentence? Because oftentimes when it comes to literature we have out there, some people might think like this is enough to say the results were inconclusive, or because the results were inconclusive, what? And this is something that it's just an exercise to practice with your own writing is, what could be added here? So I'll give you guys a minute or so to maybe think about what could you add to the sentence, and then I'll show you the example. Again, being fragments is something that you might come across in your own writing as you're working on proofreading, editing, and revision. Okay, so it's been about a minute. So again, some examples that you can run with here is, the experiment was halted because the results were inconclusive, or because the results were inconclusive, the experiment was halted. So again, in this case, you can either, keep your fragment at the comma and then add a sentence at the end, or you can do the reverse and say the experiment was halted because the results were inconclusive. So again, often fragments are things that we can add to, and this is part of the revision process moving forward. So some other things we also want to consider is when we have fragments with, misplaced periods, we often want to consider how we separate a dependent clause from an independent one. And in this example down below, you would have the sentence, our lab published 5 papers this year, period, which made this our most productive year ever. In this case, because, the first sentence can stand on its own, but the second one cannot, In this case, we could use a period, or we can switch the period to a comma, and then take the capital letter in which, and then make it lowercase. And then that would help make the sentence from a dependent clause into an independent one. And then it would help with the overall structure and flow. And again, for some people, fragments are necessarily difficult to catch. But for other people, especially when you're reading a very long paper, you might miss some of these fragments. So again, thinking about if you read your paper, or if you have someone look at it, help you look at your paper, if you start to see fragments occur over and over again, this is something you might need to just keep in mind, for future assignments. So in addition to, we often see this when we read two different sentences, is people using commas between two independent clauses. So in our example here, it says, many graduate students frequent the writing center, comma, this helps them with their writing. And we can think about making three different revisions here instead. So as you can see with the example down below, we can say revision 1, many graduate students frequent the writing center, period. This helps them with their writing. Revision 2, many graduate students frequent the writing center. You can use a comma with a which. Or revision 3, many graduate students frequent the writing center, semicolon. This helps them with their writing. And the reason I point out comma splices is, again, when you're proofreading your paper and you're going through the grammatical errors, oftentimes with academic writing, these are things that, people will be looking for. And if you have a lot of these comma splices occurring in a certain area in your paper, this is just something to keep in mind as you move forward. So if you feel like comma splices is something that you might struggle with, this slide will be helpful to review moving forward. So some other rules we also want to keep in mind too is we're thinking about commas and also in compound sentences. And I know a lot of people are familiar with the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. And oftentimes when it comes to the fanboys, the rule is if you have a fanboy, breaking up two independent clauses and they're a conjunction, you can often use a comma right before the fanboy itself. So two examples down below. The professor instructed the students to read the next chapter, comma, but the students ignored him. And then sentence 2, the bears did not seem interested in the hikers, comma, so they did not get out of the water. These are two fanboys that will be, helpful moving forward. And this rule is also common across the board. So often when you have a fanboy, think about, do you need to use a comma or not? Oftentimes you do, but sometimes you don't. But again, if you feel like you're, when you're reading through your papers, you come across a lot of fanboys, this is something you might also want to address. Some other things we want to consider when it comes to commas and also the introductory elements is sometimes you have to use a comma, between certain, a word and a phrase. So for example, you might have a single word and a direct address. So sometimes you'll say C, comma, the answer is not that complicated. So in that case, you would have to use a comma there. Sometimes with a phrase that is not a complete sentence, you might also have to use a comma, at the conclusion of their conversation, comma, the student and instructor both left the classroom. And then finally, you might use a dependent clause where the dependent clause is because we had the number of responses we needed, comma, we close the online survey. So the rule generally with a dependent clause is if you start something with a dependent clause, you might need to include a comma when the independent clause comes in. But if you end with a dependent clause, you often don't need to end with a comma. So again, commas can be a very complicated rule. And this is something that as you go through your writing, you'll have to kind of, moderate and negotiate when to use a comma for certain kinds of introductory material. But that's something, again, the Writing Center can help you with and something that over time you guys can become better self-editors of. So this is something to actually really keep in mind is, certain people have their own thoughts on the Oxford comma. So if you don't know what the word Oxford comma refers to, it's this idea that, when you have a series of 3 or more items in a list, you put a comma, after the right before the fanboy. So down below, you can see that the Oxford comma comes right before the and. So the sentence says, students must register for classes, comma, move into the dorms, comma, and buy their books before the semester begins. The Oxford comma also occurs in the second sentence after the word family, right? Jane enjoys cooking, comma, her family, comma, and her dog. And one thing you might need to double check with your professor or double check with the journal you're writing for or for your audience is, does your audience care about the Oxford comma, right? Because I've come across where some individuals are very much in favor of the Oxford comma, right? Always put a comma before the conjunction, and other people don't necessarily have an opinion. So this is something that you can explore on your own and see, does your audience care about the Oxford comma? If so, make sure you're using it. If they don't, it's something that you might not need to include in that specific assignment or paper. So in addition to with the Oxford comma, we also have the use of semicolons. So semicolons are a good substitute for a period. I like to use semicolons in my own papers. So you guys will see the example down below. The only thing to remember with a semicolon for the independent clauses is that after the semicolon, the first word should always be lowercase. If you have a period, it would be uppercase. And my only caution with a semicolon is, make sure you're varying the semicolons and periods you use in your paper, right? Because oftentimes when someone reads your documents, if you're using the same semicolon over and over again, it can look a little repetitive. So making sure you offset, how many semicolons you use and periods you use will help your paper when you're proofreading. In addition, down below, you can also use semicolons to separate items in a series in a list instead of using a comma per se. So as you can see down below, we have some classic science fiction sagas are Star Trek with Mr. Spock, semicolon, Battlestar Galactica with Lieutenant Starbuck, semicolon, and Star Wars with Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Princess Leia. So if you have any series of lists that contain a comma, you might use a semicolon to separate the items. Again, I have not seen this rule very often, but this is something to keep in mind as an additional rule to the semicolon itself. So in addition to, we've talked about, semicolons, we can also use colons in our overall paper. So a colon is the 2 dots, and often with colons, you can use it as a substitute for thus or as follows, or you can also use it for a sentence that is related to the previous sentence. So it can function like a semicolon. So in this case, you could say the professor's actions were within the guidelines of the department policy. You could have used a period, you could have used a semicolon, but in this case, because the 2 sentences are very related to each other, you can use a colon. They were justified, lawful, and proper. And the rule with colons is that you can also use it, and the word that follows after the colon, it can either be lowercase or uppercase. So I would say with colons, again, this can be very subjective. So sometimes I think professors who read papers or your audience, if they are familiar with colons, great. They may not make a comment, but other times, some people may say use a semicolon or period instead. So I would say with the periods, semicolons, and colons, consider your own stylistic choices, and then think about what your audience might interpret when you use these different grammatical things. So in terms of also the colon, you can use it to introduce both a list or a statement. So similar to what we saw with the semicolon earlier on, you can use it to introduce, a list like, okay, puppy therapy is useful for various groups, colon, college students, sick children, Oxford comma, and the elderly. Or in this case, you could say you have two options: redo the assignment or fail the course. So again, you can use a colon to introduce lists or statements in your overall paper. So something to also keep in mind as you're revising. So another rule that we also want to consider moving forward is the use of quotation marks. So quotation marks are very important because when we use quotation marks, we always want to remember that generally a period or a comma should be inside the quotation mark. And as you guys can see in the examples down below, it says quotation mark. This is a stick up, comma, quotation mark. Same with the period at the end. I want your money. The period's inside the quotation mark. So that's just something to keep in mind here, is that when you guys use periods or commas, generally you want to keep them inside the quotation mark and not outside. On the other hand, when you use comma, colons, or semicolons, you can actually include those after or before the quotation mark. So in this case, you see, right, Lewis Edridge dedicated tracks to Michael Doris, colon, then they have the quotation mark, and then right after the quotation mark, they have the semicolon. So again, this is, again, stylistic, but generally these are some rules you can keep in mind with quotation marks: periods and commas inside of it, colons and semicolons outside of it. Sure, so you had a question, right? Let me read that in the chat here. Or maybe it was just a comment, let me see. Quotation marks can be confused by plagiarism on Authenticate. Yeah, that's a good question, Cecilia. So let me address that. So for anyone here who's used Authenticate, especially with quotation marks, that's an indication that you're using a direct quote. So I would say if you want to reduce the risk of not having plagiarism on Authenticate, you might consider not as having as many quotation marks in your paper, right? Maybe use more paraphrases. So again, I know that's a lot of information to throw at all of you guys in the past hour. So the overall purpose for this presentation was, the first half, which I know is going to be very helpful for you, is really understanding what does revision look like, right? Proofreading, editing, and revising. Understanding that those are three different stages within the process itself. Proofreading you save for the very end. Revising and editing you save more for like all stages of writing. Number two, really understanding using your different models for checklists. I gave you guys a lot of different grammatical information. Those are things that you can use to review for yourself and also for your writing moving forward. In addition to, right, a lot of the errors that I pointed out, the rules are there, but it can often be hard to catch. And even when you read it out loud for yourself, it's still hard to catch. So I would say when you're reading out loud, use it as a strategy to practice proofreading, editing, and revising. And if that's not helpful, read it to someone else or come to the Writing Center and read it to a consultant, and we can help you with the process. In addition, this is very important, save proofreading for last, right? So everything we just covered, right? The commas, the semicolons, the colons, all of those things don't necessarily have to be your focus at the very first draft, right? Because the first draft, you should be very focused on, the overall content, the organization, the flow. I would say when it comes to those small grammatical errors, unless you prioritize them more highly at the beginning, you can save a lot of those for the final read through or final revisions. In addition to, you can reach out to a lot of librarians in the UNLV library for help for, different resources. And finally, all the things that I've shown you today about, revising, proofreading, editing, those skills take time, and all of our consultants have been trained to help, people do that skill. So feel free to make a Writing Center appointment, and we can definitely help you out, get started with these strategies or procedures. So again, here's our website, writingcenter.unlv.edu. You can check out our appointments, our hours and locations, our staff bios and contact information. So these are all things that you can take a look at moving forward. And again, if you guys have any more questions for us, we offer a quick question service. So any questions that we can try to answer in 10 minutes or less, you can either call us, send us an email, you can send us a Google Chat. We're in CDC Building 3. And then also, these are all of our hashtags for social media if you want to follow us. So that's everything I have for today. Thank you guys for coming. And then I can stick around for any questions we might have or need to address.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today, Andrew. And if there's no other questions, thank you to all of you that joined us to learn more about today's topic.
Oh, I think there's a question here about.
Oh, missed it. Sorry.
Oh, so okay, so Cecilia, regarding italics, if we're talking about italics and authenticate, I've never heard of a situation where like authenticate would say it's plagiarism because of italics. So I think you should be okay there. You could double check with someone about that, but from what I remember from like my experience using authenticate, I've never heard italics being an issue. Okay, cool. Are there any other questions for me about anything? I think we're good. Sorry for interrupting you. I just wanted to make sure I got that.
No, you're fine. No, definitely. No, I want the questions to be answered. That was my bad.
Oh, in quotes, use italics. Okay.
In quotes, use italics, yes?
Sorry, Cecilia, what do you mean by in quotes use italics, right? Are you talking about like, should you use italics in quotes?
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, sometimes we have a special word and then we put them between quotes, right? Quotation marks. But to avoid the quotation marks, can we use this special word italicized?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So I think it depends. So I'm just kind of like looking at like the MLA handbook. So like it said, because I'm not sure, MLA, APA, and different citation styles have it differently. This link would just be an example. This might answer your question. I would say sometimes I don't always have the answers, but like if, for example, if we're referring to MLA for this link here, MLA seems to indicate that no, in MLA style, italics in a quotation are assumed to be the original unless otherwise indicated. So yeah, I think you could use italics, that's fine. So I think it just depends on the citation style. But if we're talking about MLA, yeah, you could use the original italics. I would just say you might have to look it up sometimes. But
Well, if there's no other questions, we'll be posting this workshop on the Graduate College YouTube channel for all of y'all to reference. And that'll be it. I hope all of y'all have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much again to Andrew.
all right, thank you guys so much. Have a nice day.